everyone. Glad you're with us tonight. We are going to begin to dive into what we can call, with an umbrella term, the New World. And I don't just mean Columbus going to the Americas and wiping out a bunch of people. What we want to look at, pretty much from here to the end, is how the church develops first in the 17th and 18th centuries, and then beyond then. And you may think that since we're getting closer to the modern world, the whole process will become easier, maybe because we'll be talking about more familiar things. We know more about this era because it's closer to us. But in fact, at least for me, it's somewhat more difficult the closer you get to the present day, because the church begins to diversify in really kind of amazing ways. It diversifies theologically, it diversifies geographically, it diversifies culturally. There are so many new things that are happening as we move closer and closer to the modern world, that it's actually harder to focus, to decide what's happening to the church as a whole, and to cover all of this in the life of the church. And so we won't do everything, which we haven't done everything all the way through. But I thought I'd warn you at the outset that what we're going to primarily focus on as we go along now is on the development of the church and what we'll refer to as the more evangelical part of the church. Now, that part of the church never develops, never thinks, never operates in isolation from the rest of the church. And so we'll be talking about other elements of the church, the broader church, as well as we go along. But that will be our particular focus from here. And one way for us to think about the church after the Reformation is to think of it in terms of a church wanting to continue the Reformation. How do we take this great foundation that's been laid by the Reformers and continue to build on it? How do we continue to purify the church, to discipline the church, to develop the church, to grow the church? All of these things in many ways are a way of continuing the Reformation, but it's not just a matter of continuing the Reformation, because the church from here out is going to face a whole new litany of challenges. And if there's one thing that I hate about the nature of reality, it's that change is inevitable. You can't stop things or people from changing. And that's just as true for the church, true for Christian people. The world changes, the church changes. And I guess that's what really keeps historians in general, but church historians for our purposes, in business, thinking about what change means, how we relate to it, what changes are positive or negative. And so the church certainly in the 17th century began to face new challenges. And so to put a simple number on it, we'll look at 5 new challenges that the church faces beginning in the 17th century. First, there are new geographical challenges. Now, we know that Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, but the impact of the New World actually came rather slowly into Europe. And it wasn't just the New World of what we know today as North and South America, but it was also the expanded world of Africa and of Asia, parts of the world that in the Middle Ages, Europeans really only had a very vague notion even existed. And of course had no notion that North and South America existed. But even in the early 17th century, most Europeans, even educated Europeans, were only really dimly aware of just how vast the world really was. There was a Dutch theologian in the early 17th century who became concerned about missions when missions started to become really a thing. And at that time he said, we have to be concerned about missions because there's a whole third of the world yet to be reached. Of course, today we talk about North America and Europe as 1/3 of the world, and we talk about reaching the other 2/3 of the world. But that's how little the Europeans really understood at the time, that the world was a much bigger place than they fully realized. And that's part of the challenge that will grow as Europeans begin to reach out into the New World, into the depths of the African and Asian continents, and the challenges that will pose, challenge to missions, challenge to commerce, and then later the challenge brought on by colonialism. But also the challenge of realizing how many people in the world had never heard about Christ. What does this mean for our sense that Christ is Lord of Lords and King of Kings? How do we factor that into our appreciation of the world and what's going on with the world? So the first real challenge stems from geography and the sort of expanded connection to the physical world that Europe was beginning to experience from here out. There, of course, would be political challenges as well. The 17th century will be a time in which monarchs are flexing their muscles, or at least they're trying to. You see in the Middle Ages, there continued to be something of a commitment to the idea of a universal empire, one emperor with others underneath him. It never really actually existed, but that was kind of the way people thought about how the world ought to be, how nations ought to be, or how people should be connected to one another. But by the 17th century, the idea of universal empire is really fading by this point. And nations, the idea of nations, are becoming much more important. And increasingly, monarchs are wanting to have complete authority in their own hands. In the Middle Ages, monarchs were very limited, by and large. They were limited practically by other noblemen, noble houses, and they were also limited often by parliaments, gatherings of representatives from various parts of the people from whom the monarch had to ask for permission, usually to raise taxes or raise armies. But in the 17th century, monarchs are going to start thinking, wouldn't it be great to govern without parliaments and without having to be beholden to all of these nobility? So let's reduce the power of the great nobility, and let's get rid of parliaments if we can, and govern by divine right. In fact, if you look today, it's true. The Queen of England's motto, still in French, is God and my right. The kings of England have still not accomplished that, but that was the ideal. God has given me as monarch right to rule by divine right, and this is called absolutism, monarch as absolute ruler. And as monarchs tried to move in that direction, there was, as you would expect, pushback. There was resistance. So part of the political dynamic of the 17th and then on into the 18th century was this political tension between monarchs and other forces in society. Who would rule the nation? Would absolutism triumph, or would other forces in society triumph? So we have geographical tensions, and then we have political tensions. And then, of course, we have the challenge of a divided church. Up until the Reformation, certainly in the West at least, there had been one united institutional church. That didn't mean everyone agreed about everything, obviously, but at least theoretically, the institution of the church was united. Now the institution of the church will forever be divided. And obviously there's still, of course, the Roman Catholic Church, there's the Lutheran churches, there's the Reformed churches, but there's also growing other groups, particularly the Anabaptists in the 16th century, but over time other groups as well. And so what does this mean for the ways in which Christians think about the church? In the 16th century, when Christians thought about the church, and then as the church began to divide, Christians basically thought in terms of the true church and the false church. And what that meant, of course, knowing human nature, was mine is the true church and yours is the false church. And when that struggle seemed to just be between Catholicism and Protestantism, that sort of twofold division really kind of made sense. But did the Reformed churches really want to say that the Lutherans were a false church? See, now there's pressure that's beginning to build to think, how do we process this? How do we account for this? Are there different ways of understanding the unity of the church or the dividedness of the church oftentimes? And this will eventually lead to what we today think of as denominational thinking, and we'll get into that after we hit our break. I realize now that that second half of that first half, we had no camera, basically. The camera's been kind of screwy, so you'll just have to suffer through not seeing me for the rest of the time. But as I was saying before the break, we get into denominational thinking. We start to see that happen in the 17th century. And I mean, we take denominations today so for granted that we hardly think about it, particularly for Protestants. That way we're conditioned to think that way in America. You know, I'm a Baptist, he's a Presbyterian, you're a Methodist. I know my church is a little bit better than all of yours, but I don't want to say you're a part of a false church. So we begin to talk about pure or less pure churches. And we begin to say things like, well, the true church of Jesus Christ can exist in different institutional forms. And that really is a revolution in thinking. I mean, it's hard for us to appreciate that because we're so accustomed to it, but that really is historically revolutionary thinking. And that's one of the things that begins to change. And so with it comes the whole question of tolerance. I mean, in the Middle Ages, there really wasn't tolerance for religious dissent. I mean, everyone was obligated, with a few exceptions, but by and large, everyone was obligated to be part of the one true church. I mean, the state used its authority to force you into the one true church. But now, with the dividedness of things, should the state still try to force everybody into the one true church? Or how do we tolerate one another? How do we learn to get along in a divided world? And so that's a whole new experience for Europeans in the 17th century. And we really are, from here on out, moving in a much more modern direction. But it comes at the cost of breaking away with a lot of ideas and attitudes that had entirely dominated Christian thinking for a millennium and a half at this point. I mean, Calvin would never have agreed that there ought to be any other church in Geneva except for the Reformed Church. I mean, in his mind, once you get it right, why would you let anyone else come in and get it wrong? I mean, it's almost a public health issue in the 16th century. I mean, heresy was a disease of the soul, so you want to eradicate it. You want to inoculate people against it. But when it became clear that you couldn't eradicate false views just by wishing them away, how do you come to grips with that? How do you learn to live with one another? How do you learn to get along? So that's the third challenge, a divided church. And then the fourth challenge, what is the glue that holds culture together? What is the glue that serves as the foundation of society in Europe? I mean, you could really say that for its whole history, even before Christianity came along, religion was the glue that held the societies of Europe together. Now, that doesn't obviously mean that everyone was equally religious, and it doesn't mean that everyone was sincerely religious. I think if you look at it, the biggest religion in the history of the world might be formalism, just sort of going along with what everyone else is doing. But religion could be appealed to. Religion provided the sort of intellectual framework of how the world made sense and what were the foundations of morality. And now all of a sudden, the church is a unified institution that has been the guardian of that cultural glue that held society together, now is broken. And so what will hold us together? Well, for a while there, people said, well, kind of basic Christianity, what we all believe together, that can hold us together. But increasingly, the basic Christian message becomes vaguer and more uncertain. What does hold us together? What are the common values that we still hold through the 17th century? And then people begin to spend a lot of time talking about natural law. If we're not united on what revealed law means, maybe we can be united about natural law, what's available to our human reason that we can all agree on. I mean, we all have reason, and so if we can just reason out together what natural law is teaching, then maybe that can be the foundation and the glue that holds society together. But you see the problem, the new challenge. What's the cultural glue that holds us all together? I mean, it's plain to see today, America has this sort of challenge today, don't we? Various ethical issues, various political issues are raised today. And some of us who still hold to the old glue that held us together say things like, well, how can this happen? How can these things be changing? And then the new people who've come in are saying, well, yeah, but who has to agree with you? And so we're left wondering what's going to hold us together. What do we still have in common? What will unite us? And this was a problem that was beginning to be voiced, to be sensed already in the 17th century. And would become vastly more of a problem as the 18th and the 19th centuries wear on with new philosophical, sometimes anti-Christian teaching leading into the Enlightenment. And then also in the 18th, but most of the 19th century, new scientific discoveries that would put pressure on Christians and things that would receive Christian understandings about them. So it's a new challenge. How is the church and how are Christians going to relate to this new world? And then finally, there's this theology. There's this theology itself. Sorry, it's not just that the institution of the church was divided, but there are so many theological voices that are now being articulated. I mean, Protestants, for example, found themselves by the late 16th, early 17th century really being challenged by renewal in the Roman Catholic Church that was brought on by what we talked about, the Catholic Counter-Reformation, and everything that happened at Trent. I mean, maybe today, I think, at least, we're sort of in a position to understand where they're coming from, at least a little bit. When you look at the sudden popularity of Pope Francis, there's kind of a new energy around him for many people in the Roman Catholic Church, not all, but many. So I was thinking about this as I was preparing that there used to be a time, a couple of decades ago now, where if the news media wanted a kind of religious statement for Christmas, they went to Billy Graham. I mean, at that time, Billy Graham was sort of the voice of American religion. Now, obviously, not everyone agreed with Billy Graham, and Billy Graham didn't agree with everyone. But Billy Graham was sort of the public face of American religion. And it struck me that today, by and large, when the media wants a public face for religion, they go to some Roman Catholic cardinal, especially the places headquartered in New York. They preferably just go down the street in Manhattan to go talk to Cardinal Dolan up there in Manhattan, because they just don't have to travel very far then. And part of what struck me about how things had changed in America was this, and maybe you already knew this, but I just hadn't come to this realization yet. For the first time in history, there is no Protestant on the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court at the moment, based on how people are generally divided into religions, is entirely comprised of Jewish and Roman Catholic justices. And most younger folks, I would say, and they wouldn't know it, and some older folks may have forgotten this, but if you were alive at this point, or at least heard about this point, back in 1960, when John F. Kennedy was running for president, he had to publicly explain how it was possible even to think about having a Roman Catholic president of the United States. I mean, people today would never believe a world like that existed, but 1960 America was still such a Protestant country, and Roman Catholicism was still kind of seen as a foreign element a little bit. But today, it's almost the Protestants who are the foreigners. I mean, I'm not making any point about that, just to say that things have really changed because, of all things, we see now that Protestantism is in decline. So who do we ask to be a Protestant voice in America today? Who do we turn to for that? But as I said, Rome is revived, Rome is energetic, and then the same thing begins to happen, as I said, in the late 16th and early 17th centuries that we see today. And so suddenly there came about this generation of brilliant theologians in the Roman Church who were seriously challenging received Protestant teaching. I mean, when Luther and Calvin came along, and their immediate followers as well, Protestant leaders were so much better educated than Roman Catholic leaders that you could almost picture it as like a great army marching into a country that was undefended. Like if you could picture Nazi Germany taking over Luxembourg, that's basically how that went down. The most famous of these theologians was, at least at one point, Robert Bellarmine. He wrote a great 3-volume work called The Controversies, in which he went point by point with really great learning and actually pretty great insight as far as Catholicism was concerned, into the Bible and the history of theology to answer the Protestants. And then we see in the years after Bellarmine, over 200 individual Protestant answers to his critique were written because his critique was so powerful and in some ways so devastating that he had to be answered. I mean, the disciple of Calvin, Theodore Beza, said at one point that Robert Bellarmine was sort of the Aegean stables. If you'd never heard about the tale from Greek mythology about the 12 labors of Heracles, who you may know as Hercules, is what the Romans called him. For reasons we won't dig into today, the hero Heracles has to perform 12 labors. And one of them was cleaning out the stables of a man named Aegeus. And Aegeus had more cattle than anyone else in the land, and the stables for his cattle had never been cleaned. And they were full of so much dung that it was impossible to clean out, almost impossible anyway. So when Beza is talking about Bellarmine as the Aegean stables, that's what he's talking about. Basically, his attacks on the Protestants, while on the surface seeming like a scathing critique, were ultimately so full of rubbish that it seemed impossible to fix. But regardless of the depth of it, it was a huge challenge for a lot of people. And it required a whole new intellectual approach to the defense of the faith, a much more technical defense of the faith. I mean, if you go back and read Calvin, it may not seem like it, but Calvin is actually comparably pretty readable. He wasn't a popular theologian, he didn't dumb it down, but he is very readable in the way that he writes. But by the 17th century, theology has already become so technical that it's very difficult for the ordinary person to read. And it's not just renewed Rome that Protestantism has to deal with. It was renewed Lutheranism that challenged the Reformed churches, the renewed Reformed churches that challenged the Lutherans and the Roman Catholics, who everyone's infighting right now. And then there was a whole new branch of theology called Socinianism, named after Faustus Socinus. Socinianism, and really you're best served looking it up after we're done, but Socinianism was really kind of an anticipation, I would say, of modern theological liberalism. It began to doubt things like the authority of Scripture, the divinity of the Christ, the Trinity. But Socinus was also a very bright man who had to be answered. And so we see in a world of new challenges that we will be moving into really an ever-mounting series of growing challenges that the Protestant tradition will face as it continues to divide and redefine itself, both then and all the way to the present. Have a good night.